There's a photograph that hangs in the DeKalb County Historical Society in Alabama. It shows 11 women standing in front of a whitewashed church, all wearing identical black dresses, all with the same sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. The caption beneath it reads, "Rutledge, Family Reunion, 1938. What the caption doesn't tell you is that these 11 women weren't just relatives. They were wives and daughters and sisters who'd all married men with the same last name they were born with. And what it really doesn't tell you is what happened when one of them broke the pattern, when one of them brought a stranger home from the woods. A man with no past, no family, no name anyone could verify. This is that story, and once you hear it, you'll understand why the Rutledge family stopped gathering for reunions after 1943. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Rutledge family settled in northeast Alabama in 1862, during the worst year of the Civil War. They weren't plantation owners. They weren't wealthy. They were mountain people who built their homestead in a remote hollow where 3 creeks converged, about 14 miles from the nearest town. The land was dense with old-growth timber and limestone caves, and the family liked it that way. They wanted distance. They wanted privacy. And for the next 80 years, they got it. By 1870, there were already whispers about the Rutledges, not loud ones, just the kind of quiet talk that passes between neighbors at a general store. People noticed that the family didn't come to town often, that they kept to themselves, that when a Rutledge daughter came of age, she didn't marry a boy from the valley or the next county over. She married a Rutledge boy, a cousin, sometimes a second cousin, sometimes closer than that. The family didn't see anything wrong with it. In their minds, they were preserving something pure, something that needed to be kept within the bloodline. They believed they were chosen, protected, that their family carried something sacred that couldn't be diluted by outsiders. The pattern held for generations. Every wedding was a family affair. Every child born carried the Rutledge name on both sides. The family tree didn't branch outward. It twisted back into itself, roots and limbs tangling in ways that made the whole structure unstable. But it stood, and the family grew. By 1900, there were over 40 Rutledges living in that hollow. By 1920, there were 60. They built more cabins, cleared more land, and every single marriage stayed inside the family line. Then came 1941, the year everything started to unravel. The year a girl named Opal Rutledge turned 19 and refused to marry the cousin her father had chosen for her. Opal was different from the other daughters. She'd been allowed to attend school in town for a few years, something rare for Rutledge girls. She'd seen how other families lived. She'd read books. She'd heard music on a radio at the school teacher's house. And when her father told her she'd be marrying her second cousin Raymond that spring, she told him no. Not quietly, not with submission. She looked him in the eye and said she'd rather die than marry a man who was already half-brother to her by blood. Her father locked her in the root cellar for 3 days. When she came out, she didn't apologize. She didn't relent. She ran, straight into the woods, toward the deep places where even the Rutledges didn't go. And when she came back 2 weeks later, she wasn't alone. The man Opal brought back didn't look like anyone from the valley. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with black hair that hung past his shoulders and eyes so pale they looked almost colorless in certain light. He wore clothes that seemed handmade, stitched from animal hides and rough wool, and he didn't speak much. When he did, his voice was low and soft, like someone who'd spent years talking only to himself. Opal introduced him as Silas, just Silas. No last name, no family, no town he came from. She said she'd found him living in a cave system about 8 miles north, deep in the old forest, where the creeks ran underground. She said he'd been living there alone for years, maybe longer. She said he was kind, that he'd saved her when she'd gotten lost and injured her ankle, that he'd fed her and cared for her and asked for nothing in return. And she said she was going to marry him. The Rutledge family was horrified. Not because Silas seemed dangerous, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he was an outsider, a stranger, A man with no lineage they could trace, no blood they could verify. Opal's father demanded to know where Silas had come from, who his people were, what his real name was. Silas just stared at him with those pale, unblinking eyes and said his people were gone, that he was the last of them, that his family had lived in these mountains long before the Rutledges ever arrived, and that they'd all died off, one by one, until only he remained. He didn't offer details. He didn't tell stories. He just stood there, calm and silent, like a man who'd already made peace with being alone in the world. Opal's father forbade the marriage. The family elders gathered and declared that if Opal went through with it, she'd be cast out, disowned. Her name would be struck from the family Bible. She'd lose her inheritance, her place at family gatherings, her right to be buried in the Rutledge plot. They thought the threat would be enough. They thought she'd break. But Opal had already made her choice. In May of 1941, she and Silas were married by a circuit preacher in town, with no family present, just two witnesses pulled in from the street. When the ceremony was over, Opal didn't go back to the hollow. She and Silas built a small cabin on the eastern edge of the family's land, far enough away that they wouldn't be seen but close enough that Opal could still walk to the main homestead if she wanted. She didn't want to leave entirely. Despite everything, she still loved her family. She still hoped they'd come around. They didn't. For months, the Rutledges pretended Opal didn't exist. They wouldn't speak to her, wouldn't acknowledge her in town. If she walked past them, they'd turn their heads. It was as if she'd died. But Opal endured it. She and Silas lived quietly. He hunted and trapped. She kept a garden. Neighbors who saw them said they seemed happy, that Silas was gentle with her, that he built her furniture by hand and sang to her in a language no one recognized. Some people thought it was beautiful. Others thought it was strange. A few thought it sounded older than any language they'd ever heard, like something that shouldn't still exist. Then, in the winter of 1942, Opal became pregnant, and that's when the Rutledge family started paying attention again. The pregnancy changed everything, not because the family suddenly forgave Opal, but because they became afraid. The elders started having meetings in the main house, late at night, behind closed doors. Neighbors reported seeing lanterns burning in the windows until dawn. Some of the younger Rutledges whispered that the family was worried about what kind of child Opal would have, what blood it would carry, whether it would still be Rutledge blood at all, or something else entirely, something they couldn't control or understand. The family had spent 80 years keeping their bloodline closed and pure, and now Opal had shattered that. She'd introduced something unknown into the family tree, and they didn't know what it would grow into. Opal's mother was the first to break the silence. She walked to the cabin one morning in early spring and knocked on the door. When Opal answered, her mother didn't apologize. She didn't embrace her. She just looked at Opal's swollen belly and said the family wanted to help, that they wanted Opal to come back to the main house for the birth, that it wasn't safe for her to deliver a baby out in the woods with only Silas to help her. Opal refused. She told her mother she had everything she needed, that Silas knew herbs and remedies, that he'd delivered animals before and understood the process. Her mother's face went pale. She begged Opal to reconsider. She said the family was willing to let Silas stay in one of the outbuildings, that they'd even allow him to be present for the birth. But Opal had to come home. Opal asked her mother why. Why now, after months of silence, did the family suddenly care? Her mother didn't answer. She just turned and walked back through the trees. 2 weeks later, Opal went into labor. It was a difficult birth. It lasted nearly 2 days. Silas stayed by her side the entire time, speaking to her in that strange, soft language, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, giving her teas that dulled the pain but kept her conscious. On the second night, when Opal was screaming so loud that people in the main homestead could hear her echoing through the hollow, Silas delivered the baby himself. A girl, small and pale, with a full head of black hair and eyes that opened immediately, wide and alert, staring up at the ceiling like she was looking at something no one else could see. Silas wrapped her in a wool blanket and placed her in Opal's arms. Opal wept, not from pain, from relief, from joy. She named the baby Iris. The Rutledge family heard about the birth within hours. Opal's youngest sister, Maeve, had crept close to the cabin during the labor and listened from the woods. She'd heard the baby cry. She'd seen Silas step outside at dawn, covered in blood, and look up at the sky like he was thanking something. Maeve ran back and told the elders everything. They gathered again that night. This time, the meeting was louder. There was arguing, shouting. One of the uncles reportedly said they should burn the cabin down, that the baby was cursed, that it wasn't fully human. Opal's father silenced him. He said they needed to see the child first. They needed to know what they were dealing with. And so, 3 days after Iris was born, the entire Rutledge family walked to Opal's cabin in a silent procession. 32 people, men, women, and children, all of them, standing in the clearing outside the cabin, waiting. Opal came to the door holding Iris. The baby was awake, eyes open, staring at the crowd with an unnerving stillness. No one spoke. They just looked. At the baby's pale skin, at her black hair, at the way her eyes seemed too knowing for a newborn. One of the aunts started crying. One of the uncles made the sign of the cross. Opal's father stepped forward and asked to hold the child. Opal hesitated. Then she handed Iris to him. He cradled her for a long moment, studying her face. Then he gave her back to Opal and said one word: abomination. Opal slammed the door in their faces. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She just shut them out and locked the door from the inside. The family stood there in the clearing for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Then they left. But the damage was done. The word had been spoken. And once a Rutledge elder named something, that name stuck. From that day forward, the family began to treat Iris not as a child, but as a threat, something that needed to be watched, contained, maybe even destroyed. Weeks passed. Opal and Silas kept to themselves. They didn't go into town. They didn't visit the main homestead. Silas hunted at night, moving through the woods like a shadow, and Opal stayed inside with Iris, nursing her, singing to her, trying to convince herself that everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine. Strange things started happening around the cabin. Animals would gather at the tree line and stare. Dozens of them. Deer, foxes, raccoons, even birds, all standing perfectly still, watching the cabin in silence. Opal would step outside and they'd scatter, but the next night they'd be back. Silas didn't seem bothered by it. He told Opal the animals were curious, that they recognized something in Iris, something old. Opal didn't ask what he meant. Then the Rutledge children started having nightmares, all of them, at the same time. They'd wake up screaming, saying they dreamed of a baby with black eyes standing at the foot of their beds, staring at them without blinking. The parents tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as fear spreading through the family like a sickness. But the nightmares didn't stop. They got worse. The children said the baby in their dreams would whisper to them, not in English, in something else, something that made their ears hurt. One boy, only 7 years old, woke up speaking in a language his parents didn't recognize. He spoke it for 3 hours straight before he finally collapsed from exhaustion. When he woke up, he couldn't remember any of it, but his mother had written some of it down. She showed the paper to one of the elders, who took it to a professor at a college 2 counties over. The professor said it looked like a corrupted form of a Native American dialect, one that hadn't been spoken in over 200 years, one that shouldn't exist anymore. The Rutledge family was terrified. They became convinced that Iris was doing something to them, that she was cursed, that Silas had brought something unnatural into their bloodline. Opal's father called another meeting. This time, he didn't invite everyone, just the men, just the ones he trusted. They met in the barn and spoke in low voices about what needed to be done. Some of them wanted to confront Silas directly, to demand that he take the baby and leave. Others said that wouldn't be enough, that the baby had already infected the family, that her presence alone was poisoning them. One of the uncles suggested something darker. He said the only way to stop it was to remove the baby entirely, permanently. Opal's father didn't agree to it, not out loud, but he didn't stop the conversation either. He let it sit in the air between them, let the idea take root. 2 nights later, someone tried to break into Opal's cabin. She woke to the sound of the door being forced open, the scrape of metal on wood. She grabbed Iris from the cradle and ran to the back room where Silas was already awake, standing by the window with a hunting knife in his hand. He told her to stay quiet, to stay down. Then he moved toward the door. Opal heard shouting, a struggle, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, then silence. When Silas came back, his hands were covered in blood. He didn't say whose. He just told Opal they needed to leave, that it wasn't safe anymore, that the family wouldn't stop. Opal begged him to give it more time, to let her try to reason with them. Silas looked at her with those pale, unblinking eyes and said there was no reasoning with people who believed their blood was sacred, that they'd kill to protect it, that they'd already tried once, and they'd try again. Opal didn't want to believe him, but deep down, she knew he was right. They left the cabin 3 days later. Not permanently, just far enough to feel safe. Silas led Opal and Iris deep into the forest, to the cave system where he'd been living when Opal first found him. The caves were vast, miles of tunnels carved into limestone, with underground streams and chambers large enough to stand in. Silas had made one of the chambers livable years before. There was a fire pit, bedding made from animal furs, shelves carved into the rock walls. It was cold and dark, but it was hidden. No one from the Rutledge family knew where it was. No one had ever ventured that deep into the woods. Opal hated it at first. She hated the dampness, the way sound echoed, the feeling of being buried alive. But Iris seemed calm there. She didn't cry. She slept peacefully in Opal's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Silas said the baby felt safe in the earth, that she understood it in a way most people couldn't. They stayed in the caves for 2 weeks. Silas would leave before dawn to hunt and gather supplies, and he'd return before dark. Opal spent the days caring for Iris, talking to her, trying to keep her spirits up. But the isolation was breaking her. She missed sunlight. She missed her sisters. She missed the life she thought she'd have. One night, she told Silas she wanted to go back, that she wanted to try one more time to make peace with her family. Silas didn't argue. He just told her that if she went back, she needed to be prepared for what they might do. That fear made people dangerous, that the Rutledges weren't going to change their minds. Opal said she had to try. For Iris, for the chance that her daughter might grow up knowing her family. Silas nodded. He said he'd go with her, that he wouldn't let her face them alone. They returned to the cabin on a Sunday morning in late summer. The air was thick and humid, and the cicadas were screaming in the trees. When they emerged from the woods, Opal saw that someone had been there. The garden had been trampled. The door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, everything had been destroyed. Furniture overturned, clothing torn, the cradle smashed into pieces. On the wall, someone had painted a single word in black tar: demon. Opal stood in the center of the room, holding Iris, and wept. Silas didn't say anything. He just started gathering what little remained: a few blankets, a cooking pot, Opal's Bible, which had been thrown into the fireplace but hadn't burned. He wrapped everything in a canvas sack and told Opal they needed to leave, that they couldn't stay, not even for a night. But Opal shook her head. She said she needed to see her mother. One last time. She needed to know if there was any love left, any forgiveness. Silas didn't try to stop her. He just told her he'd wait at the tree line, that if she wasn't back by sundown, he'd come looking for her. Opal walked to the main homestead alone, carrying Iris in her arms. When she arrived, the family was gathered on the porch, all of them, men, women, children. They'd been expecting her. Her father stood at the front, his face hard and unreadable. Opal stopped at the bottom of the steps and asked to speak to her mother. Her father said her mother didn't want to see her, that none of them did. Opal's voice cracked. She said she just wanted them to look at Iris, to see that she was just a baby, an innocent child, that whatever they believed about her was wrong. Her father's expression didn't change. He said the baby was a corruption, that she carried blood that didn't belong, that the nightmares hadn't stopped, that the animals were still gathering at night, that children in the family were getting sick with fevers no doctor could explain. He said it was all because of Iris, because of what Silas had brought into their family. Opal begged. She said they were wrong, that they were letting fear blind them. Her father raised his hand and pointed toward the woods. He told her to leave, to take the baby and the stranger and never come back. He said if she ever set foot on Rutledge land again, they'd kill her. Not out of hatred, but out of necessity, to protect the family. Opal turned and walked away. She didn't look back. When she reached the tree line, Silas was waiting. He took Iris from her arms and held her while Opal collapsed to her knees and sobbed. She cried until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her body was shaking. Then she stood up, wiped her face, and told Silas they needed to disappear. Completely. That there was no life for them here anymore. Silas agreed. He said he knew a place, far north, deep in the mountains where no one would find them, where they could live in peace. Opal nodded, and that night, under the cover of darkness, they left. They took nothing but what they could carry, and they never came back. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. The Rutledge family never spoke of Opal again. Her name was struck from the family Bible, just as they'd promised. Her sisters were forbidden to mention her. Her photographs were burned. It was as if she'd never existed. But the nightmares didn't stop. The children kept waking up screaming. The animals kept gathering at the edge of the property, watching. And the fever spread. First it was the children, then the young mothers, then the elderly. By the fall of 1942, 12 members of the Rutledge family had fallen ill with a sickness no doctor could diagnose. High fevers, delirium. They'd speak in tongues, thrashing in their beds, crying out for water that never satisfied their thirst. 3 of them died, 2 children and an old woman. The family buried them in the family plot and tried to convince themselves it was just bad luck, a harsh season. But they knew better. Deep down, they knew it was connected to what they'd done, to the baby they'd called an abomination, to the daughter they'd cast out. Opal's father became obsessed. He spent hours reading the family Bible, searching for answers, trying to understand what had happened to his bloodline. He spoke to traveling preachers. He consulted with an old woman in town who claimed to have the sight. She told him that the family had been cursed, that they'd rejected something sacred, that the baby they'd condemned carried a bloodline older than their own, older than Christianity, older than the settlers who'd come to these mountains. She said the baby was a bridge between worlds, between the old ways and the new. And by rejecting her, the Rutledges had severed something that should never have been broken. The old woman warned him that the curse wouldn't lift until the family made amends, until they acknowledged what they'd done and asked for forgiveness. Opal's father asked how. The old woman shook her head. She said it was too late, that Opal was gone, that the bridge had been burned, that all the Rutledges could do now was endure. By 1943, the family was falling apart. The sickness had claimed 7 lives. Marriages were crumbling. The younger generation was leaving, moving to cities, desperate to escape the hollow and whatever darkness had settled over it. The annual family reunion that year was the smallest it had ever been. Only 23 people showed up. They gathered in front of the whitewashed church, took a photograph, and then scattered. Most of them never returned. The homestead began to decay. Buildings collapsed. Fields went fallow. The family that had once numbered over 60 dwindled to less than a dozen. By 1950, only Opal's father and 2 of her sisters remained in the hollow. They were old, broken, haunted by what they'd done. Opal's father died in 1952. On his deathbed, he called for a priest and confessed everything. He said he'd damned his family, that he'd let fear and pride destroy them, that he'd rejected his own daughter and grandchild because they didn't fit the image of purity he'd built in his mind. The priest asked if he'd tried to find them, to apologize. Opal's father shook his head. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness, that some sins were too great to be absolved. He died that night, alone, whispering a name, Iris. The last 2 sisters lived in the hollow until the early 1960s. They kept to themselves. They didn't marry. They didn't have children. When they died, within months of each other, there was no one left to bury them in the family plot. The county took care of it. The homestead was abandoned. The land was sold off piece by piece to developers and logging companies. By 1970, there was almost nothing left of the Rutledge family. No descendants, no legacy, just overgrown foundations and a few crumbling headstones in a forgotten cemetery. The family that had spent 80 years obsessing over bloodline purity had extinguished itself, and the daughter they'd cast out, the one they'd called a curse, had simply disappeared into the mountains, and was never seen again. But that's not where the story ends. Because in 1987, a hiker stumbled across something in the deep woods of northeast Alabama. A small settlement, 4 cabins built in a clearing near an underground spring. The hiker approached cautiously. The cabins looked old but well-maintained. Smoke was rising from one of the chimneys, and then he saw them. People. A family. Men, women, children, maybe 15 of them in total. They were dressed simply. They moved quietly, and when they noticed the hiker, they stopped and stared. Not with hostility, just with curiosity. The hiker waved. One of the women stepped forward. She was elderly, with long white hair and pale eyes. She asked if he was lost. The hiker said he was just exploring. He asked who they were. The woman smiled. She said they were just a family, that they'd lived in these woods for a long time, that they preferred to be left alone. The hiker nodded and apologized for intruding. As he turned to leave, he noticed something. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, watching him from behind one of the cabins. She had black hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed too aware, too knowing. She didn't blink. The hiker felt a chill run down his spine. He left quickly and didn't look back. The hiker reported what he'd seen to the local ranger station. He gave them coordinates, described the settlement, mentioned the strange family living miles from any road or town. The rangers said they'd look into it, but they weren't concerned. People lived off-grid in these mountains all the time. Survivalists, hermits, families who didn't trust the government. It wasn't unusual, but the hiker couldn't shake what he'd seen, especially the little girl, the way she'd stared at him, like she could see straight through him. He went back 3 weeks later with a friend. They hiked to the same coordinates, but when they arrived, there was nothing there. No cabins, no clearing, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Just dense forest and limestone rock. The hiker swore he had the right location. His friend thought he'd imagined it, that he'd gotten turned around in the woods and fabricated the memory. But the hiker knew what he'd seen. He knew it was real. Over the years, there have been other sightings. Hunters who've reported seeing smoke rising from deep in the forest where no one should be living. Campers who've heard singing in a language they didn't recognize, echoing through the trees at night. In 2003, a wildlife photographer captured something strange on film. He was documenting deer migration patterns and set up motion-activated cameras throughout the forest. When he reviewed the footage weeks later, one camera had captured a group of people walking through the frame at dusk. 7 of them, moving in single file, wearing simple, handmade clothing. They weren't hiking, they weren't carrying modern gear. They looked like they belonged to another time. The photographer enhanced the images. In the clearest frame, you can see a woman at the front of the line. Elderly, white hair, pale eyes. Behind her, several younger people, and at the very back, a tall figure with long black hair. The photographer submitted the footage to a documentary series about unexplained phenomena. It aired once, then the footage disappeared. The photographer claimed the production company lost it, but he'd made copies. He posted them online. Within days, they were taken down. Copyright claims, terms of service violations. He tried to re-upload them. His account was suspended. He eventually gave up, but people who saw the footage before it vanished still talk about it, about the way the figures moved, about how they seemed completely unbothered by the camera, like they knew it was there and simply didn't care. Some locals believe the Rutledge family never really died out, that Opal and Silas survived, that they raised Iris in isolation, deep in the mountains, and that Iris grew up and had children of her own, that there's an entire hidden bloodline living in those woods, a family that exists outside of records and documents in modern society, a family that carries something ancient in their blood, something the Rutledges tried to destroy but couldn't. Others think it's just legend, that the sightings are misidentifications, that people see what they want to see, that the story of Opal and Iris has become local folklore, nothing more. But the DeKalb County Historical Society still has that photograph from 1938, the 11 women in black dresses. And if you look closely at the far right of the image, partially obscured by shadow, there's a 12th figure, a young woman holding something in her arms. The photograph is damaged in that spot, water-stained and faded. but some people swear they can make out what she's holding. A baby, with black hair, and eyes that seem to stare directly at the camera. The Rutledge family spent 80 years trying to keep their bloodline pure. They married cousins to cousins. They rejected outsiders. They convinced themselves they were protecting something sacred. But in the end, their obsession destroyed them. The very thing they tried to preserve, they poisoned. And the daughter they cast out, the one they condemned as an abomination, may have been the only one who truly survived. The only one who understood that blood doesn't have to be pure to be powerful. That family isn't about control or fear or maintaining some imaginary standard of perfection. It's about adaptation, evolution, allowing new things to enter, allowing the bloodline to grow and change and become something stronger than it was before. The Rutledges couldn't accept that, and so they vanished. But somewhere in those mountains, in the deep places where the old forest still stands, there may be a family that learned a different lesson, a family that carries the blood of both worlds, old and new, known and unknown, a family that thrives in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. And if you ever find yourself hiking in the remote corners of northeast Alabama, and you see smoke rising from a place where no one should be living, or you hear singing in a language that sounds older than time itself, maybe don't go looking for answers. Maybe some families are meant to remain hidden, some bloodlines are meant to exist outside the boundaries we understand, and some stories are better left unfinished. Because the truth is, we don't know what happened to Opal and Iris. We don't know if they're still out there. But the fact that we don't know might be the most unsettling part of all. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're from. Tell us if you've ever encountered something in the woods you couldn't explain. And if you want more stories like this, stories that dig into the dark corners of history that no one talks about, make sure you're subscribed. Because there are more secrets buried in the American past than you can imagine. And we're going to keep uncovering them, one story at a time.